Britain and France had conservative governments in the 1930s. These governments focused on law and order as their economies collapsed. They did not attempt to help the people. Hitler established, of course, a brutal dictatorship, banned oppositions, persecuted the Jews and other groups he didn't like. Stalin, by then, had seized control of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, instituted his notorious 5-year plans to industrialize and boost employment as Russia sunk into the Great Depression. FDR, in some sense, was a nice middle ground for considering these other options. He rejected socialism, Nazism, as well as classical economics, which called for the government staying out of things. FDR was in no way a revolutionary. FDR saw his efforts to reshape the U.S. economic system as an attempt to save capitalism because he and the others in power feared a communist revolution. John Maynard Keynes approved of this. We'll talk about Keynes, who's an economist, a little bit more in a second. You have made yourself the trustee for those in every country who seek to mend the evils of our condition by reasoned experiment within the framework of the existing social system. Keynes said if FDR failed, the only options would be orthodoxy, which is to say do nothing, or revolution. And I want to emphasize there was no plan. It was just a progressive reliance on expertise and a willingness to experiment. Here we see this legendary political cartoon where Uncle Sam is being treated with all these medicines. These medicines have abbreviations, which are FDR's New Deal programs. And then you have FDR with Congress as his nurse saying, well, we might have to try something else as if this doesn't work. They're really just throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks. And FDR was a manager. He wasn't an ideologue. He wasn't a technocrat. He didn't really understand any of these things. He went out and he hired what he thought were capable people and let them do what they do. The Secretary of Labor, which, by the way, is the first woman in a cabinet position, was Frances Perkins, who had emerged from the Hull House movement that we talked about with Jane Addams, as well as the New York Consumer League, which would organize boycotts over working conditions, and had been a personal first-hand witness to the girls jumping out of the building in the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. Harry Hopkins, who oversaw had come from the New Deal style programs in New York. He had worked with FDR when he was governor. Harold Ickes was from Teddy Roosevelt's 1912 run. Remember, Franklin idolizes Teddy, and so he brings his people in. And Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, that labor lawyer who had ended up on the Supreme Court, had been an advisor to Woodrow Wilson, was a close advisor to FDR. There was a call to break up corporations, claiming that they had kept prices high and wages low. But FDR's, what he called his brains trust, who were largely Columbia professors who advised him, said corporations were a necessary evil. They also argued that real competition was dead. We had become an oligopoly in terms of our economic system. And they said the federal government had to use its power to direct these corporations. And to largely positive effect during this period, they did. FDR was inaugurated on March 1st, 1932. Here we have this legendary picture of Hoover and FDR writing to the inauguration, and then that's turned into this fantastic drawing. In that address, of course, FDR famously calls for action. This is where he says, we have nothing to fear but fear itself, mindless, unreasoning, paralyzing fear that turns needed effort for advance into retreat. Walter Lippmann said, the U.S. was in such a state of confused desperation that it would have followed almost any leader anywhere he chose to go. And FDR's primary job in those early days was to project confidence, was just to convince Americans that the stuff he was going to try might actually work. The banks, as we talked about, were collapsing. Most states had suspended banking because they could no longer regulate it or keep the banks from failing. FDR stepped in with a federal bank holiday. Now, he said they were going to close all the banks for a minimum of 4 days, and then federal auditors were going to go in, make sure the banks were solvent, make sure that bank wasn't going to collapse, and when they were satisfied with what was on the books, the bank would reopen. This was done in a special session of Congress, by the way, right as on the first day of the administration. And so we get the Emergency Banking Act, which also pumps money into the banks to shore them up. 3/4 of the banks open after those first 4 days, and they get a federal seal of approval telling the public the federal government has looked over the books and this bank is safe. This worked. It restored confidence in the banking system, And within a few days, $1 billion of consumer deposits come out of from under the mattress and the coffee can and back into the banking system, saving the American banking system. Then the Glass-Steagall Act is passed, which says banks can no longer buy stocks with investor money. One of the reasons why the Great Depression happens is you would go put your money into the bank, and the bank would take your money as, theoretically the custodian of your money, and then they would go buy risky stocks with it. And then when the stock market crashes, all your money is gone. Incidentally, Glass-Steagall was repealed a few decades ago, so that's why the economy's become so unstable again. They also create the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is an insurance policy banks pay into that will pay you if the bank goes under. We recently had a big bank go under in California, but the depositors got their money back. Right now, I think it's up to $500,000 or so in each individual bank. You would get your money back. FDR also begins the process of moving us off the gold standard on there you see, by May 1st, 1933. This is called the bombshell message. But this was so that we could print more money, so that our money supply wasn't directly tied to how much gold we have in the vault. Between 1929 and 1932, 5,000 banks failed. By 1936, it's a third of all the banks in the country, by the way. By 1936, 4 years into these reforms, 0 banks have failed. FDR's first 100 days have become legendary. Now all presidents are measured by their first 100 days. He passed, or signed into law, I should say, Congress passed, dozens of agencies, and they were all abbreviated into 2 or 3 or occasionally 4-letter combinations. And this was called the alphabet soup, and you see it there in these cartoons. This was an unmatched use of presidential power in such a short period of time, and it scared some people. The National Industrial Relief Act was modeled on the World War I cooperation between corporations and the federal government, on Hoover's volunteerism. It established the National Recovery Administration. And what that did was it worked with industries to establish codes. The businesses got to have a hand in writing the rules on themselves, which included things like, they focused on labor. So it included things like minimum wage payments and minimum hours worked, or maximum hours worked, actually more like standard on output working conditions, in an attempt to end cutthroat competition and allow wages to rise. Businesses that went along got exempted from the antitrust, anti-monopoly legislation. This is also an end to laissez-faire. Now, businesses also had to recognize unions' right to exist, to participate. It was all voluntary. Businesses could say, no, we're not going to do these things. But if you did participate, you could put a blue eagle on your product, as you see in that label, or in the window of your store. And then Americans were taught by the government that if a business didn't have a blue eagle, they weren't helping fight the Depression. They were being selfish and putting their own interest. And Americans largely stopped using businesses that weren't displaying the blue eagle. So they used this sort of social pressure, like we saw with Florence Kelly's New York Consumers League, to where the public is pressuring the businesses to do what's best for the economy as a whole. It's a really interesting model. In reality, a study in 1934 headed by Clarence Darrow said that this helped big businesses and hurt small businesses. It also said that in the end, it raised prices, limited production, and cost jobs, not grew jobs, and divided the market among just more oligopolistic competition. Union recognition, while officially required to be given to join the program, was often ignored, and they didn't bother to police it. There were more than 750 sets of these codes, and nobody was actually enforcing them. It did more for morale than it actually ever did for workers. Government feared what was called at the time the dole. That is, being given money by the government for the government to support you. But people, of course, wanted to work. There are thousands of letters written to FDR personally because people thought he was their friend and he was trying to help them in a way they had not thought of other presidents. I'll talk about why that is in a minute. And these people did not say, can we have money? They said, I just need a job. If I can just find a job and get back on my feet, then everything is going to be okay. I just want to work. And I just want to tell you that the vast majority of people in this country in need, that's what they want, is they want a good job. And you know, if I may editorialize, that's what we should be focused on in trying to help people. The Economy Act cut government pay for shared suffering. Like, hey, just because we work in the government doesn't mean, you know, we're going to be doing much better than you. The Federal Emergency Relief Act in May of 1933 gave federal dollars to local relief agencies. FDR and John Maynard Keynes, though, the economist who was advising him by now, preferred jobs programs. The Civilian Conservation Corps was started in March 1933 and focused on preserving forest, flood control, building national parks. If you've ever been in a campsite or a ranger building in a national park, that was very likely built by the CCC. And also preserving forest and other pieces of nature. My mother's father worked in the CCC during during the Great Depression. Excuse me. That's how he and his family got by. From 1933 to 1942, it put 3 million people to work at $30 a month and contributed massively to the preservation of the environment and the creation of the park system. The Public Works Administration, which was Ickey's big idea, was part of the National Industrial Relief Act. They spent $3.3 billion on this. It contracted with private companies so the government would pay to build things like roads, schools, hospitals, etc. The Civil Works Administration was direct. It did not contract with private companies. It was directly run by the government. By January of 1934, 4 million Americans have been employed through these programs. They built highways, tunnels, courthouses, airports, etc. It was dissolved over complaints about cost and the dependency on the federal government for its funding, of course. But you can still see these things that they built here, 80-something years later, around your community. I promise. There's stuff there. The Tennessee Valley Authority was created to, first off, fight the corrupt electricity monopolies that dominated the southeastern United States and price gouged, but also to control flooding in the rivers connected to the Tennessee River Valley. It electrified the Southeast with cheap, affordable electricity and was wildly popular in that area. It is a preview of federal projects that we'll see in the West. In an area of the country that now decries federal involvement, it's just interesting to point out how important federal involvement was to developing that area in the first place.